They told you to stay small, to stay quiet, to stay predictable. Funny thing is, the moment you stop playing their version of you, something shifts in the air. People don't always understand it, but they feel it. That invisible pressure, that quiet storm building behind your eyes. It's not anger. It's not madness. It's realization. You start noticing how the room changes when you walk in, how conversations tighten, how smiles get a little forced, because deep down, they recognize something they don't want to name. You were never powerless. You were just surrounded by people who benefited from you forgetting it. You were never weak, not in the way they tried to define you, not in the way they labeled you when you were quiet, when you were unsure, when you were still learning how to stand in your own mind without collapsing under the weight of other people's expectations. Weakness was never your truth. It was a narrative built around your silence, shaped by those who only felt powerful when you doubted yourself. They mistook your patience for inability, your hesitation for lack of strength, your silence for absence of power. But silence is not empty. It is compressed energy. It is observation. It is calculation. It is the space where awareness grows without interruption. You were watching everything when they thought you were lost. You were absorbing patterns when they assumed you were unaware. You were understanding people when they believed you could not understand yourself. That is not weakness. That is containment. And containment always reaches a breaking point. There comes a moment when everything you have been holding without expression begins to reorganize itself inside you, not as confusion but as clarity. You stop reacting the way they expect. You stop shrinking to fit the roles assigned to you. You stop seeking permission for thoughts that were always yours. The world often confuses softness with fragility. But softness is what allows pressure to pass through without breaking the structure. You endured things that would have shattered those who pretended to be strong. You adapted in environments that were never designed for your growth. You learned to survive in rooms where your presence was not fully welcomed, and still you remained observant, still you remained aware, still you remained you. That is not weakness. That is endurance under disguise. They built their understanding of you from moments where you chose restraint over reaction. They thought restraint meant lack of power. They did not understand that restraint is control, and control is a higher form of strength than impulse. Anyone can break, anyone can react, anyone can explode, but not everyone can hold themselves still while everything inside them is capable of motion. That ability to pause, to calculate, to wait to understand timing, that is not emptiness, that is dominance in silence. And somewhere along the way, you started to see through the illusion. You started to notice that the voices defining your limits were never measuring your potential, only their comfort. You began to recognize that every label placed on you was more about their fear of unpredictability than your actual ability, because an unpredictable mind cannot be controlled easily, and a mind that cannot be controlled begins to look dangerous to those who depend on control. That is why they preferred you uncertain. That is why they preferred you doubting. Because doubt keeps potential dormant. But the moment doubt begins to fade, something else takes its place. Awareness. And awareness is the first form of real power. Not loud, not dramatic, not visible at first, but undeniable in its effect. It changes how you walk, how you look, how you respond, how you exist in spaces that once made you shrink without realizing it. You were never weak. You were only unawakened to the fact that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly inside you, waiting for recognition, waiting for permission that it never needed in the first place. The moment you realize your worth, everything around you shifts, not because the world changes instantly, but because your perception of it stops being negotiable. You begin to see that the same environment that once made you question yourself has not actually changed at all. Only your tolerance for its illusions has started to disappear. What used to feel like authority now feels like noise. What used to feel like approval now feels irrelevant. What used to feel like rejection now feels like confirmation that you are no longer aligned with spaces that require you to shrink in order to belong. There is a subtle but undeniable transformation that happens inside you before anyone else notices it outside. You stop asking if you are enough and start questioning why you were ever taught to measure yourself through broken scales. Worth was never something to be earned through exhaustion, through silence, through sacrifice of identity. It was something you carried even when you were unaware of it, even when you handed too much of yourself away just to maintain peace in places that never deserved it. People who were comfortable with yourself, doubt begin to feel uncomfortable with your awareness. Not because you have become louder, but because you have become precise. You no longer misinterpret disrespect as normal interaction. You no longer confuse attention with value. You no longer mistake familiarity for loyalty. That shift alone alters the balance in every room you enter, because people adjust to versions of you they can predict, not versions of you that understand themselves. The realization of worth is not a moment of celebration. It is a quiet collapse of illusions you once depended on. You start seeing patterns you ignored before. Who benefited when you stayed uncertain? Who stayed close when you undervalued yourself? Who became distant when you stopped overgiving? These patterns were always there, but awareness turns them from background noise into undeniable structure. And as that awareness grows, your presence begins to change without effort. You speak less but mean more. You observe more but explain less. You stop performing emotions just to make others comfortable. You stop softening truths that were always meant to be direct. Not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. Because when you recognize your worth, you no longer see yourself as something that needs constant validation to exist properly. The shift is rarely welcomed by everyone. Some people will try to pull you back into older versions of yourself, not because they hate you, but because they were comfortable with the version of you that required less accountability from them. The moment you stop fitting into that version, their reaction reveals more about them than it ever did about you. They will call it change, attitude, distance, ego, but what they are actually reacting to is your refusal to return to blindness. There is a strange kind of silence that follows self-realization. Not emptiness, but clarity. You begin to notice how much energy was spent maintaining relationships, situations, and expectations that never aligned with your actual value. And in that clarity, you stop chasing what does not recognize you. You stop lowering yourself to be understood by those who were never willing to look deeper than convenience. Everything shifts, not externally at first, but structurally within perception itself. And once perception changes, nothing remains truly the same again. Silence is your power. When words are no longer necessary, not because you have nothing left to say, but because you have understood that not everything deserves expression, and not every truth requires permission to exist. There comes a stage where speaking becomes a reaction, and silence becomes a strategy. Most people misunderstand silence as absence, as emptiness, as retreat, but silence is often the most controlled form of presence. It is observation sharpened into awareness. It is patience refined into precision. It is restraint shaped into dominance without noise. When you begin to understand silence, you stop rushing to fill gaps in conversations that were never asking for your clarity. You stop explaining yourself to those who were never listening to understand. You stop defending thoughts that are already complete within you. Words lose their urgency because you realize urgency was never about truth. It was about validation, and validation is a demand that drains more than it builds. Silence gives you access to something words often destroy, which is control over timing. In silence, you are not reacting to the moment, you are studying it. You are reading what people reveal when they believe nothing is being taken in. You are noticing contradictions, patterns, shifts in tone, changes in behavior that spoken language often tries to hide, while others are busy performing their versions of reality. Silence allows you to see the raw structure beneath it. There is a difference between being quiet and being silent in power. Quietness can be accidental, but silence in power is intentional. It is chosen. It is maintained. It is used. When you choose silence, you are no longer participating in unnecessary exchanges of energy. You are deciding that your presence does not require constant explanation. You are allowing your existence to be felt rather than announced. People begin to misinterpret that silence. They assume distance where there is observation. They assume ignorance where there is understanding. They assume submission where there is calculation. But silence does not need correction. It does not need to prove itself. It continues unaffected by interpretation because its strength is not dependent on being understood immediately. In silence, your mind becomes louder than the environment around you, but in a controlled way. You start hearing things that words would have interrupted. You begin to notice what people say when they are not trying to impress, what they reveal when they forget to perform, what they expose when they believe they are safe. Silence becomes a lens that sharpens perception instead of dulling it, and slowly you realize that most power struggles are built on reaction. Whoever reacts first often loses control of the situation. Silence breaks that pattern. It removes predictability. It creates space where others are forced to reveal themselves while you remain unchanged. In that stillness, you are not participating in chaos. You are studying it from a distance that protects clarity. Silence also removes the need to argue for your position, because arguments often assume that truth is something that must be defended loudly. But real understanding does not require defense. It requires recognition. And recognition does not come from volume. It comes from clarity that stands untouched even when challenged. There is a point where silence stops being something you use and becomes something you are comfortable within. It stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like structure. It becomes the space where your thoughts are not interrupted by external noise, where your awareness is not diluted by unnecessary engagement, where your presence is no longer scattered across explanations that never needed to exist in the first place. People don't fear you, not in the way they claim, not in the way they explain it to themselves when they try to sound rational about their discomfort. What they fear is not your current state, not the version of you standing in front of them today, but the version of you that is quietly forming beneath everything they can see. They react to possibility, not presence. They respond to potential, not proof. And potential is always more unsettling than reality because it cannot be measured in its early stages, only sensed. There is something unsettling about a person who is no longer fully predictable, not because they have changed dramatically, but because they have started to notice themselves in ways that cannot be reversed. People become comfortable with limits they can recognize. They build expectations around your patterns, your responses, your silence, your compliance. The moment those patterns begin to fracture, even slightly, they start adjusting their perception, not of what you are, but of what you might become if that fracture continues expanding. What they fear is not aggression, not confrontation, not loud defiance. Those are simple to categorize, simple to label, simple to contain. What unsettles them is evolution without announcement. When someone starts shifting internally, without seeking permission, without broadcasting intention, without waiting for validation, the entire structure others built around them starts to lose stability. Because control depends on predictability, and predictability depends on stagnation. They were never observing your strength as it is. They were observing your strength as it was convenient for them to interpret. Every time you held back, every time you stayed quiet, every time you chose restraint, they translated it into permanence. They assumed stillness meant limitation. They assumed patience meant absence of ambition. They assumed silence meant absence of direction. But they were only reading snapshots of a process that never stopped developing underneath. And somewhere in that unseen development, you stopped being fully available for those interpretations. You stopped reacting in ways that confirmed their assumptions. You started existing with a layer they could not access directly. That layer is what creates discomfort, because people can adjust to who you are, but they cannot easily adjust to who you are becoming when they are not included in that transformation. Fear begins where control ends, and control begins to dissolve the moment someone realizes they are no longer the author of your limitations. The idea that you might surpass the version of yourself they once understood is more disturbing to them than any action you have taken so far, because action is visible and finished, but becoming is continuous and unpredictable. They watch for signs, small inconsistencies, subtle shifts in behavior, changes in how you respond to pressure, changes in how long you tolerate what you used to accept immediately. And each of those signs becomes evidence in their mind that something is moving forward without their involvement. They don't always speak it, but they feel it in the way your presence no longer fits neatly into their expectations. What they fear is not confrontation from you, but independence from their interpretation of you. A mind that stops needing external definition becomes harder to contain. A person who stops seeking approval becomes harder to influence. A presence that no longer adjusts itself for comfort becomes harder to predict. And unpredictability is what creates tension in environments built on control. And the most unsettling part for them is that you might not even be aware of the exact extent of what you are becoming yet. That uncertainty on your side mirrors their uncertainty about you. And that mirror effect creates pressure without words, shifts without movement, tension without direct conflict, a kind of silent realization that what they once labeled as fixed is no longer fixed at all, and what comes next is not something they are positioned to define anymore. Your presence alone disrupts comfort zones built around you, not because you are actively trying to unsettle anything, but because your existence begins to challenge the silent agreements people make with themselves about stability. Most comfort zones are not built on strength. They are built on repetition, familiarity, and the avoidance of discomfort that comes with change. When you enter a space carrying awareness that no longer matches the expectations of that space, something subtle begins to shift before a single word is spoken. It starts with perception. People begin to notice details they used to ignore. The way you stand without seeking validation. The way your eyes don't search for approval before you speak. The way your silence does not feel empty anymore, but intentional. These things disturb environments that depend on predictability. Because comfort zones are not just physical spaces, they are psychological structures maintained collectively by everyone who agrees not to question them. Your presence introduces uncertainty into systems that were built to avoid it. Not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through awareness that no longer participates in blind acceptance. When someone stops adjusting themselves to fit the expectations of a room, the room itself begins to feel different. People who were once relaxed start becoming slightly more conscious of their behavior. Conversations that once flowed without thought start becoming measured. Even silence in the room begins to feel heavier, because it is no longer being filled automatically. The disruption is not loud. It is structural. It happens in the background of interaction, where people start realizing they are being observed in a way they cannot easily influence. Not judged, not criticized, but understood at a level that makes performance less effective. Comfort zones depend on invisibility of awareness. When that invisibility disappears, the structure weakens. There is also a shift in how people relate to their own identity when they are around you. Some begin to question the roles they have been playing for too long. Others become defensive without knowing why. Because your presence reflects something they have avoided acknowledging within themselves. It is not that you say anything directly. It is that you no longer mirror back the illusions they are used to seeing. And when reflection changes, perception collapses into discomfort before rebuilding itself in a different form. You become a variable that cannot be fully accounted for. Not because you are unpredictable in action, but because you are no longer fully predictable in intention. And intention is what people rely on to feel safe around others. When intention becomes unreadable, assumptions lose stability. That instability is what they feel as disruption. Even those who try to maintain control of the environment begin to adjust unconsciously. Their tone shifts, their pacing changes, their need to assert familiarity increases. They may not recognize it, but they are responding to a silent pressure created by awareness that no longer conforms. Comfort zones start revealing their edges when someone stops respecting those edges, and the more you remain in that state of self-aligned presence, the more obvious it becomes that disruption was never something you initiated. It was something revealed through contrast. Because what you carry is not noise, it is clarity that does not ask permission to exist within spaces that were designed to remain unquestioned. Spaces that were never prepared for awareness that does not shrink itself. Awareness that continues expanding without needing acknowledgement. Awareness that simply remains there, altering the atmosphere in ways people try to rationalize, but never fully articulate. Especially when the silence in the room starts feeling like it is no longer neutral, but aware of itself in ways that begin to shift everything underneath, without anything visibly changing yet. Power was never given. It was always inside you, not placed there by permission, not handed over through recognition, not granted by approval or validation from anyone who claimed to define your limits. What people often misunderstand is the idea that power must be inherited, awarded, or taken from external sources, when in reality it exists first as awareness, then as control, and finally as presence that no longer depends on external confirmation to function. From the beginning, it was never absent. It was only unrecognized, covered by uncertainty, buried under conditioning, hidden beneath layers of doubt that were taught through repetition rather than truth. You were taught to look outward for strength, to measure yourself against reactions, responses, and judgments that were never designed to reveal your real capacity. And in that misdirection, you temporarily accepted the illusion that power was something others had, and you had to earn. But power does not operate on permission. It operates on recognition. The moment you begin to see your own patterns clearly, the moment you begin to understand your own reactions instead of being controlled by them, something shifts internally. You stop being purely reactive and start becoming observant. That shift alone begins to change the structure of your decisions, your responses, your boundaries, even your silence. What was once unconscious becomes deliberate. What was once automatic becomes calculated. Not in the sense of manipulation, but in the sense of awareness replacing impulse. That is where power begins to surface, not as domination, but as understanding of self that cannot be easily influenced by external pressure. People often search for power in control over others. But real power starts with control over internal instability. When your emotions stop dictating your direction, when your reactions stop defining your identity, when your presence is no longer dependent on external approval, you begin to move differently in the world. That difference is what others notice before they can explain it. They may interpret it as confidence, arrogance, distance, or change, but what they are actually witnessing is alignment, a state where internal awareness no longer contradicts external behavior. That alignment removes inconsistency, and inconsistency is what makes people predictable and easily influenced. Once inconsistency fades, influence becomes harder to apply. There is also a shift in how you perceive resistance. What once felt like opposition starts feeling like noise that no longer alters direction. Challenges no longer define your stability, because stability is no longer built on external conditions. It is built internally, where external conditions can no longer fully disrupt it. That is not detachment. It is independence of interpretation, and in that independence, something subtle happens in how others respond to you. They begin to sense that influence does not work the same way it used to. Attempts to provoke reactions become less effective. Attempts to define your limits become less convincing. Attempts to place you into familiar categories begin to fail, because categories require predictability, and predictability requires external control, both of which start dissolving when internal awareness takes precedence. Power was never outside you waiting to be discovered. It was inside you waiting to be acknowledged without distortion. And once acknowledged, it does not announce itself loudly. It does not seek validation. It simply becomes the way you exist, the way you observe, the way you remain unchanged by what once had the ability to define you from outside, the way presence itself begins to carry weight without needing explanation or reinforcement, the way silence and awareness start functioning together without requiring approval from anything beyond itself.